Hi everybody, and welcome back to Murder at Bedtime. As you know, I think you are all awesome, and remember, all the waffle is all at the end if there is any, and if you choose to listen to it, it's totally up to you. I would like to thank Keep It Simple, who is one of my YouTube subscribers who suggested this very interesting case, and with that, let's crack on. It was a bright October morning in South Kent, Connecticut in 1941. One early riser stretched and opened the curtains, staring bleary-eyed at the blue sky. As she took in the view, she caught sight of the ramshackle dwelling at the top of the hill. She thought to herself that she hadn't seen the elderly reclusive lady that lived up there for quite a while, and a pang of guilt hit her. She did pop up there now and again to see if she needed anything, and she hadn't been up to see her recently. And she thought today she really should go and check that she was okay. When she finally reached the bungalow, she knocked and waited, but receiving no reply, entered and looked around. The first thing she noticed was all the flies. There were swarms of them. And there on the sofa she recognised the lady she only knew as Florrie. She was undoubtedly deceased and was surrounded on that sofa by about 20 cats. What nobody realised in the town of South Kent was that this relatively unknown woman, who kept herself to herself and had been living out her later years in near squalor, had 50 years ago been, for a short while, arguably the most famous woman in the world. Florence Florrie Elizabeth Chandler was born in 1862 in Mobile, Alabama, to wealthy parents William George Chandler, a banker, an ex-mayor of Mobile, and Carrie E. Holbrook Chandler. Florrie's father died before she was born, and her mother was now on husband number 3, this time to a baron, Baron Adolf von Rock. Now that's R-O-Q-U-E, so excuse me if I've pronounced this wrong and made him sound like a German heavy metal band. He was, though, in fact German, and was an officer in the 8th Cuirassier Regiment of the German Army, so this also made Florrie's mother a Baroness. Baroness von Rock, no less. Now, I really do have no idea how these two hooked up, but I did read somewhere that Florrie had lived and studied in Germany at some time, so maybe it was then. One thing I do know is that the Baroness and Florrie, now 18, were off on their holes to explore Europe. They boarded the SS Baltic on the 12th of March 1880, first stop Liverpool, England, then onward to Paris. How it happened, nobody really knows, but on the voyage, Florrie became very close to a man 24 years her senior, a cotton trader from Liverpool called James Maybrick. They started spending nearly all their time together, until, as they neared England, the headstrong and impulsive Florrie announced to her mother that she would not be accompanying her onwards to France, as she was in love with James and would be marrying him and staying in England. Now, I can only imagine how well that conversation went, but whatever charm Maybrick had used on this young lady, he had chosen to omit a few details. For instance, he failed to tell her that he already had a mistress called Sarah Ann Robertson in Whitechapel, London, with whom he had 5 children with, and to who he paid £100 annual allowance, a lot of money in those days. Also to the fact that he was, as they knew in them days, an arsenic eater. In fact, he couldn't get enough of the stuff. He had contracted malaria years before in Virginia, and even though he had recovered from the disease, he had become addicted to the drugs he was prescribed to treat it. But all the same, they were married at St. James's Church, Piccadilly, on the 27th of July, 1881. They then returned to live in Virginia, America for a couple of years before returning to live at Battlecrease House in Aigburth, a suburb of Liverpool, with their two children, Gladys Evelyn and James Chandler. Now, Florrie may well have been bored with her husband being away a lot of the time, but boy, could she spend money. Money that they didn't have. She took out loans against land and jewellery that she would inherit one day, loans her husband knew nothing about until much later. So much so that James had to tell her they were in financial difficulties and she would have to rein in her spending. But Florrie had found out about her husband's mistress, and now, rather openly, started an affair of her own with a young friend of the family and fellow cotton trader, Alfred Brearley. They had spent a weekend together at a hotel, and it is thought it was supposed to be for a week, but was cut short because Alfred admitted to being in love with someone else, which tends to put a bit of a dampener on the moment. So Florence stayed with friends for the remainder of the week, returning home on Friday the 28th of March. In any case, James had sort of found out, and after a day at the Grand National, the next day, on Saturday the 28th of March, Florence infuriated him by walking off briefly with Alfred. When they got home, he gave her a thrashing, blackening her eye in the progress. Staff members had to intervene to help her. James now angrily told her that he would be seeking a divorce and he would be cutting her completely out of his will. He went to see a solicitor to change his will, so Florrie would get nothing. So we can only assume that Florence wanted James to find out about her affair to hurt him, as she made very little effort to keep it secret. And, of course, it wasn't long after she had found out about his mistress and children in Whitechapel. But it's also said in other reports that she may have had quite a few affairs of her own already, and one in particular with James's brother Edwin. But that's just speculation. What we do know is that on the 27th of April 1889, James took 2 doses of strychnine and was taken ill. Doctors were called and he was diagnosed with dyspepsia. And what did they do? Yes, they prescribed more poison, this time hydrogen cyanide. Of course, everyone was amazed that this didn't cure him, but really, unsurprisingly, 3 weeks later, on May the 11th, 1889, he died in agony. So this is when the witch hunt against Florence started in earnest. Even though her husband was known to keep arsenic hidden all over the house, was also known to visit his local chemist up to 5 times a day for an arsenic pick-me-up, and his body showing only a trace of arsenic at the autopsy and not a lethal dose, it was down to a combination of nasty snide gossiping staff and the brothers Grimm themselves, Michael and Edwin Maybrick, that got the ball rolling. Firstly, the nanny, Alice Yap, was given a letter from Florrie to post for her. It was a letter from Florrie to her lover Brearley, which basically described her infatuation with him. This letter never reached him, as Alice Yap opened it, her explanation being she had given it to Florrie's daughter to carry and she had dropped it into a puddle of mud. She had taken it out of the envelope to put it in a fresh one. OK, but I'd better give it a read while I'm at it. And then instead of doing what she was going to do, she now gave it to Edwin Maybrick, who read it, then forwarded it to his brother Michael. When he arrived, after being called by a family friend, Mrs. Briggs, who also disliked Florrie and thought Michael should come to Liverpool because something strange is going on here. A nurse also said that she had witnessed Florence tampering with a bottle of meat juice that she was going to give to her husband. When tested, it was found to contain arsenic, but Florence said she had indeed added the arsenic, but her husband had begged her to. And then there were the fly papers that Florence had bought from a chemist and were in a clear sight, soaking in a saucer of water to get the arsenic out of them on her bedside table, which she said were for making a facial wash, which was the fashion for ladies in those times. She mentioned she had a recipe but couldn't find it. Now, it would seem pretty obvious that with arsenic stashed away all over the house that she would doubtfully need to soak fly papers to get enough arsenic to kill her husband. But the seeds had been sown, and 3 days after her husband died, she was arrested for the murder. Florence stood trial for her husband's murder at St. George's Hall on Wednesday the 14th of August 1889, and after a 7-day trial she was found guilty. But whether she did it or not, the trial was a sham, and would have been thrown out for lack of evidence in present times, even if it was just for the behaviour of the judge. The judge was a man who had started his descent into madness, so much so that Judge Justice Stephen would die in an asylum 4 years later, mad as a box of frogs. This bias and hatred towards Florence on account of her unfaithfulness to her husband knew no bounds, even though he knew of James Maybrick's affairs, just showing the hypocrisy of the age. His bile-filled summing up of her, which took up 2 whole days of the 7-day trial, sealed her fate. Now, there's been a lot of debate at the performance of a defence counsel, Sir Charles Russell, also, and the fact he was past his prime, but I found that he put up a good fight. Most people thought he had won the case until the intervention of the judge in the end. The jury took just 35 minutes, that's the all-male jury, to find Florence guilty of the murder of her husband. She, of course, was sentenced to hang by the neck until she was dead. But the public opinion had been turned on its head in 7 days. Since Florence was spat at by other women in the courtroom for being adulterous, never mind being a suspected murderer, she was now being defended from all sides. Now it was the judge having to flee the mob along with the jurors. Thousands and thousands of ordinary people, members of Parliament and doctors and surgeons, signed petitions, and the judge was interviewed multiple times by the Home Secretary Henry Matthews and the Lord Chancellor Lord Halsbury. On the 22nd of August, with the gallows already erected at Liverpool's Walton Jail, the Home Secretary reprieved Florence, and she was resentenced to serve life in prison. She spent her time in Woking Prison and then Aylesbury Prison, where I live, the town, not the prison. When in January 1905, 14 years after her conviction, she was smuggled out of Aylesbury Prison secretly in the dead of night and taken by a cab with a prison warden to a convent down south for a short time before being allowed to travel back to the USA and regain her citizenship. Once home, she spent a short time doing lecture tours, talking about her life behind bars and her life and prison reforms, but this petered out and she ended up living out her days in a dirty 3-room shack surrounded by cats. She never saw her children again. They were brought up by the family doctor. Ironically, but very sadly, her son James, a mining engineer, died in an accidental poisoning in 1911 when he mistook a glass of cyanide solution for water. I couldn't find what happened to the inheritance she stood to receive from her mother's death. Maybe she received it and lived the way she did by choice. But most reports state she died penniless. I couldn't find out. Florence was laid to rest in the grounds of South Kent School, Connecticut, next to her great friend Clara Dulon, as she had wished. Now, this story was about the life of Florence Maybrick. As some of you may know, her husband James was, and maybe still is, suspected of being Jack the Ripper, as is James's brother Michael. Now, unfortunately, Jack the Ripper leaves me stone cold. But I will say I still researched them both and read Bruce Robinson's 2015 book called They All Love Jack about his claim Michael was the Ripper and it was covered up by the Freemasons. I personally don't believe either were Jack the Ripper, so I'm not going to include them in this story as suspects. However, if you want to know why I don't think they are, then I'll gladly tell you if you ask me. But I will say I won't argue about it because I just don't care enough about the subject and I don't know enough about the subject. Oh, just as a point of interest, remember the recipe for the face cosmetic made with arsenic that Florence couldn't find before she was arrested? Well, after her death, it was found between the pages of a battered Bible in her bedroom. The thing that really nags away at me, as I've already said, was what happened to her inheritance from her mother, who was a very rich lady. Why did Florence die in poverty? If anyone knows, please message me. In fact, message me anything to do with the case. You know I love to hear from you. I don't really have much waffle tonight, apart from some shout-outs. Firstly, to a new listener, Ashley Piggott. Thank you very much for listening, Ashley, and thanks for your support. And then to my 4 favourite ladies. Debbie Q of the Right Shoe podcast, who is back at last, and I'm doing a collaboration with her next week on the American case about Victoria Martins. Now, wow, I hadn't heard of this case, but it really is a shocker. So listen out for that, please. Secondly, to the amazing Cindy and Diva of Twisted Listers podcast. If you haven't listened to this podcast, please do. You won't be disappointed. They really do put so much work in and they work so well together. And last but no means least, the beautiful Inside and Out Lindsay of Stolen From Me podcast. Such a talented, kind lady with such a big following. She deserves it. Please give her a listen too. Just to say, if you listen on podcasts, please rate and review. It always helps. And if you're watching on YouTube, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, ding the bell for further notifications of future episodes. It doesn't cost a penny, and it really helps me, apparently. Once again, thank you for Keep It Simple for suggesting this case. I hope I did it justice. And as always, thank you to Jonathan Segev for the continued use of Cursed Lullaby as my intro music. I do actually love all his music, but it's so nice that he lets me use that. As always, you know, I think you are all awesome. Thank you for your continued support. Stay safe, and most importantly of all, sleep well. See you next time.